This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 796 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Each week on this Sleeper Show, I'll be looking at players who are rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might be able to throw into your lineup. Now, I know Yahoo percent rostered numbers aren't everything. I know that some of these guys might not be available in your league, but it's just a cutoff for me to talk about the non-high-end players each week. Plus, every week, I'm going to force myself to give you some plays in the under 10% bucket. So players rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues. So those will be guys more readily available in your specific league. Because I'm talking about low-end players, I'm going to be wrong on this show a lot. But each week at the top of the episode, I quickly recap my hit and misses in order to keep everyone on the same page. Also, keep in mind that the players that I talk about on this show are not must-starts. They're simply players that you might want to consider starting in a pinch. With that being said, if you do want to see where I have these players ranked, you can check out the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. To access it, just head to lateround.com and click Patreon. Through Patreon, you can get access to my weekly rankings and tiers. Okay, with that all out of the way, let's get to the sleepers this week. The first tier of players that I'm going to talk about on the show each week consists of guys who are rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And the first and only quarterback that I'm going to talk about in this tier is my favorite streamer of the week, Sam Howell. As I talked about this offseason, Howell has dual threat ability. In his lone start last year, he ran the ball 5 times for 35 yards and a score. At UNC during his final season, he ran for over 800 yards. He's an athlete. He can generate some fantasy points with his legs, which is always something that we look for. In week 1, he gets Arizona, arguably the worst team in football. The Commanders are strong favorites, giving them an implied team total that ranks 14th here in week 1. And the Cardinals have a weak secondary, specifically at cornerback. Even if Terry McLaurin can't go, Jahan Dotson should not have any issues. Howell should be able to have a solid outing. Now, I'm not starting him over someone like Dak Prescott or Geno Smith, but I do think that you could consider him over a player like Derek Carr this week. They're in the same tier for me. Now, at running back, Tank Bigsby is still under that 50% mark on Yahoo, and he makes plenty of sense this week. The Jags are 4.5-point road favorites against the Colts. It's an Indianapolis team that's without Jonathan Taylor, and it's a team starting an inexperienced rookie quarterback. There's a shot that we see a nice positive game script for Jacksonville, and that could lead to better usage for Bigsby. He's probably going to get work regardless of game script, and there's still a chance that he actually ends up being Jacksonville's goal line guy this year. But Bigsby was a good prospect in my model. He has the ability to catch passes out of the backfield, and if this game does favor Jacksonville, I'd anticipate the Jags not going super hard and giving the ball to Travis Etienne. They want to save Etienne. Right now, Bigsby's firmly an RB4 for me, so in deeper formats, he might be flex-worthy. In that same game is Deion Jackson. I talked about the Colts backfield a bit on the 15 Transaction Show, and here in week 1, not beyond, but just here in week 1, I think Deion Jackson's the play. Evan Hall's a rookie. He hasn't gotten real game reps. Zach Moss is injured. If Moss ends up suiting up and going, I'll be far less bullish on Jackson, because a full-blown committee would be likely. But if the committee is just a split backfield between Jackson and Hall, I'd expect Jackson to see all of the important work. That's goal line and receiving work. Even though I think Hall is more than capable of doing that. Jackson also beat up this Jags team last year. He caught 10 passes and he scored on the ground. He's a high-end RB4, maybe a low-end RB3 if Moss officially doesn't go this week. The last running back in this tier that you might want to consider this week, although I hope that you don't have to consider him, is Gus Edwards. The name of the game with running back sleepers is game script. Baltimore is the biggest favorite on the slate this week. FanDuel Sportsbook has them as 10-point home favorites against Houston. J.K. Dobbins is probably going to get a ton of run. But if this game gets out of hand, if it's really a double-digit score differential, then I'd anticipate the Ravens using other running backs to drain clock and to wind things down. That would include Gus Edwards and Justice Hill. Now, I actually think that there's a chance that Justice Hill is more valuable than Gus Edwards this season. There's a new offense. There's a new offensive coordinator in town. But Edwards is probably the safer bet to carry a bigger workload in a game environment like this. He's the bulkier of the two backs, and he's had experience doing it. So Edwards is a decent enough dart for super deep leagues. At wide receiver, I'm looking at a guy that I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show, Marvin Mims. Jerry Jeudy could very easily be sidelined this week. It's not official right now, but it's trending that way. It's good that he's not on IR, but he was expected to miss several weeks with his hamstring injury. That makes Marvin Mims sort of the de facto number 2 wide receiver to start the year for the Broncos, behind Courtland Sutton, which means he could find the field a lot here in week 1. Mims can line up everywhere, and he's a serious vertical threat. So one big play, and he could pay off. During his 3 collegiate seasons, according to PFF, he had average depth of targets of 17, 17.6, and 15.4, which is absolutely wild. The matchup's a good one against a Raiders secondary that ranked 3rd worst according to PFF's secondary rankings entering the year. Mims truly could have a breakout day. I think an easy go-to this week would be Van Jefferson. There's no Cooper Kupp, so Van figures to be the top wide receiver for LA. Now, I don't feel great about it because I don't think Van Jefferson is that great. He's never had a season with a target share per game rate higher than 16%, and his yards per route run rate has always been below 1.5. Those are literally the definition of average. But he's had 5 games above a 20% target share in his career, and in those contests, he's averaged a respectable 13 PPR points per game. With inexperience alongside him in Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell, he could walk into a lot of volume in what could be a negative game script against Seattle. The last wide receiver in this tier that I want to call out is Rashid Shaheed. Sometimes you just need some big play players on your team. Shaheed, as a rookie, ended last year with an absurd 14.4 yards per target rate and one of the best yards per route runs that you're going to find for a first-year wideout. That was obviously on fewer routes than a player like Garrett Wilson or a player like Chris Olave, but it's still something to get relatively excited about. The Saints get the Titans in week 1. They allowed the 3rd highest completion rate on 15-plus air yard throws last year. It's a secondary that has some pieces, and they add Sean Murphy-Bunting this offseason. But there's still a lot up in the air there. If you're looking for a sleeper, you might as well target one who could make one big play and pay off. Rashid Shaheed can do that. And then at tight end, I have 4 of them for you. The first one is Rashid Shaheed's teammate, Jawan Johnson. Johnson's exiting a season where he had about a 15% target share per game while ranking 13th in red zone targets at tight end. You get the quarterback upgrade in Derek Carr, and he played starter snaps in the preseason. You're really hoping a tight end streamer can just find the end zone. And he's got just as good of a shot to do that as any other tight end streamer, any other tight end in that tight end 2 range. The next guy, Greg Dulcich, the guy that I've talked about plenty this offseason. There's a real chance that this whole Adam Troutman thing comes to fruition, and Dulcich ends up being a dud. But I'm going to bet on talent. Dulcich's rookie campaign last year saw him with the 3rd best target share per game rate among all first-year tight ends since 2011. The only tight ends with higher marks were Kyle Pitts and Evan Ingram. He looks good in my year 2 model, and Jerry Jeudy, like I said earlier, could be sidelined. That could naturally lead to more volume, and it's a plus matchup against a beatable Vegas defense. There's also Jake Ferguson. I said what needed to be said about Ferguson on the 15 Transaction Show, but I'll quickly say it again. Among the almost 90 rookie tight ends since 2011 who ran 100 or more routes, Ferguson's yards per route run and targets per route run rates ranked in the top 10. There's no more Dalton Schultz. Jake Ferguson looks like he's going to be the tight end 1, the starter in this Dallas offense. So I think there's season-long upside with Ferguson, and it could start this week. And then finally, another player from 15 Transactions, Luke Musgrave. Now, it'll help if Romeo Doubs and or Christian Watson are out this week because they're banged up right now. They might not go this weekend. But even if they do, Musgrave is set to run the most routes at tight end for the Packers right away, as a rookie. And like I said earlier this week, it's not that rookie tight ends can't be good in fantasy football. It's that they're usually not getting a high number of routes because they're learning the game. They're getting acclimated to the NFL. They're learning to block and catch the ball. But with Musgrave, and this could extend to Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid too, but with Musgrave, they're going to need him to be a receiving threat. He's extremely athletic, which is what we should always be looking for with a breakout tight end. And the matchup should be okay against Chicago. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a nice debut, although he is certainly a risky play. This is always my favorite part of the episode each week because I get to talk about some super random players. like Baker Mayfield. Now, do I think that you're going to start Baker Mayfield in a single quarterback league this week? No, of course not. That would be silly. Do I think there's some intrigue there? Yeah, actually I do. The Bucs get Minnesota, a secondary that really struggled at times last year. They allowed the 9th most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks. This game could force the Bucs into a pass-heavy script, even if they don't necessarily want that. Minnesota's at home, they're 6-point favorites. The Bucs are 6-point underdogs. The game has a decent 45.5-point over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook too. And Mayfield at least has the weapons, right? Chris Godwin and Mike Evans both have decent matchups. And not only are they going to naturally get funneled targets because they're good, they're the most talented players on that team, but Minnesota was 7th in adjusted target share allowed to wide receivers last year too. I don't think Mayfield is anything but a pretty desperate superflex play, but he makes sense under this 10% mark. Now moving on to running back, let's go back to the idea of game script, and let's target Kyren Williams. I think that he has a shot for some cheap production this week. There's talk that he could end up being the pass-catching back in the Rams' backfield this year, and if that's the case, a negative game script is going to favor him a lot more than Cam Akers. And as I said earlier, the Rams are decent underdogs against Seattle this week. Seattle was also pretty bad against the position last year too, ranking as the 6th best matchup for running backs in adjusted points allowed, and they were top half in the league in adjusted target share allowed to the position. I don't think Williams is that special of a player. He definitely lacks the explosiveness, but he was a good receiver in college, so we know the skill set's at least there. At wide receiver in this tier, I'm looking at my guy Jayden Reed, especially if Romeo Doubs is out or Christian Watson, who's also on the injury report. Reed's going to play the slot for Green Bay this year. And like I said in the 15 transaction show, there's a non-zero chance he just ends up being the best receiver on this team. It's not likely, especially not likely to hit this season, but there's a possibility given the fact that his prospect score was in line with Christian Watson's. I'd imagine him getting involved more in 2 wide sets if Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson is out, which would be a huge boost to his overall value this week. But even if those guys are in, Reed could surprise, similar to Luke Musgrave. And then I have 2 tight ends in this tier to talk about. One of them is Baker Mayfield's tight end, Cade Otton. I think Otton's just been way undervalued all offseason, given the fact that as a rookie, he ran 465 routes. That was one of the highest marks that we've seen since 2011. Now that's partially because Tampa Bay threw the ball a ton. His targets per route run, his yards per route run, pretty brutal last year, I'm not going to lie. Which is why talent still matters at tight end, even when you do get that opportunity. But Otton played almost half of his snaps from the slot last season, and the Bucs are down at wide receiver outside of Godwin and Evans. I like Trey Palmer as a potential breakout, but Otton at least has some opportunity. If he improves as a pass catcher and as a player here in year 2, we often see that with tight ends, he could end up being a high-end tight end 2 or even a low-end tight end 1 this year. And then with Travis Kelce's injury, at the time of this recording, I don't know if he's going to be in or not this week, but if he's out, I do like Noah Gray. Gray ran the 2nd most routes at tight end last year for Kansas City. He'd likely be the main tight end if Kelce's out. And it's in a potential shootout environment against the Lions. And the Lions were one of the worst teams at defending the position last year. So you can go Gray's way if you're hurting at tight end. Now, as for the streaming defenses, teams like Washington, Denver, and New Orleans, they're too high rostered right now. So I'll go back to Seattle at home in a plus matchup against a Cooper Kupp-less Rams team. But Seattle at home, Matthew Stafford in a negative game script without his top weapon, sign me up. There's also Green Bay against Chicago. Justin Fields takes sacks. We know that about him. And that led to Chicago being the 5th most advantageous matchup for opposing defenses last year when adjusting for strength of opponent. The Bears offense will almost definitely be better this year, but there should be sacks at least for Green Bay. And in the last defense, don't sleep on the Falcons. This is a deeper play, but they're facing a rookie quarterback, they're at home, they're favorites, and the over-under in that game is under 40 points. The Falcons are actually a pretty safe option. And if they can make the rookie feel uncomfortable, if they make Bryce Young feel uncomfortable in the pocket, turnovers could come. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. We got the mailbag episode and late round perspectives dropping tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.